On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed 6 minutes after takeoff. 157 people died. It was the second time in 5 months that the same model of Boeing aircraft had fallen out of the sky. The same model, the same flaw. The second time. Boeing stock dropped. Investigations opened. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide, the longest grounding of a commercial aircraft in aviation history. But here is the thing the headlines missed. This didn't happen because of a bad bolt or a rogue engineer. It happened because of a board meeting, probably several. To understand what Boeing lost, you have to understand what Boeing was. Founded in 1916 on the shores of Lake Union in Seattle, Boeing spent most of the 20th century doing one thing extraordinarily well: building airplanes that didn't fall out of the sky. The 707 reshaped commercial aviation in 1958. The 747, the jumbo jet, democratized international travel in 1969. These were not incremental improvements. These were civilization-level engineering achievements. Boeing didn't just make planes. Boeing made the modern world a smaller place. By the early 1990s, Boeing employed over 100,000 people, the majority of them in Washington state. Its engineers had a saying inside the company: "If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going." That wasn't arrogance. That was a reasonable reading of the evidence. The company's culture was engineering first, almost to a fault. Executives came up through technical ranks. Decisions went through layers of review. It was slow. It was sometimes frustrating. It was also the reason their planes worked. Then came 1997. Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas in a deal valued at approximately $13.3 billion. On paper, it was Boeing absorbing a weaker competitor. In practice, it was the other way around. McDonnell Douglas had spent the previous decade under intense Wall Street pressure. Its leadership had developed a very different philosophy: cut costs, maximize short-term returns, treat the stock price as the scoreboard. They called it smart business. Boeing's old guard called it something else. The McDonnell Douglas executives didn't just join Boeing. They took over. Harry Stonecipher, a McDonnell Douglas veteran, eventually became Boeing's CEO. He once said explicitly that his goal was to change the culture at Boeing so that it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm. He said the quiet part loudly. What followed was a systematic dismantling of everything that had made Boeing Boeing. Engineering authority was gradually subordinated to financial metrics. The company began outsourcing not just components but core design work, reportedly to reduce costs by hundreds of millions of dollars annually. In 2001, Boeing moved its headquarters from Seattle, where its planes were built, to Chicago. The symbolism was not subtle. The people running the company no longer needed to be near the people building the planes. Distance, it turns out, is a terrible quality in an aerospace manufacturer. Through the 2000s, Boeing spent lavishly on stock buybacks, an estimated $43 billion between 2013 and 2019 alone. That is money that did not go into R&D, that did not go into new platforms. That went to shareholders. The stock went up. The engineering capability quietly eroded. By the time the 737 MAX program was approved in 2011, the cultural transformation was complete. Boeing was now in a race against Airbus, which had just announced a fuel-efficient new narrow-body jet. Boeing had a choice: build an entirely new aircraft or update the aging 737 frame. A new aircraft would take 10 years and cost an estimated $20 billion. They updated the 737 to fit new, larger, more fuel-efficient engines onto a 50-year-old airframe. Engineers had to move the engines forward and higher. This changed the plane's aerodynamics. The nose pitched up under certain conditions in a way it never had before. This was a real, documentable physical problem. Boeing's solution was a software system called MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It was designed to automatically push the nose down when sensors detected a stall risk. One sensor. Singular. A single point of failure on a commercial aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers. Airlines were not fully informed of MCAS's existence. Pilots were not given adequate simulator training for a system that could override their inputs and point the aircraft at the ground. Boeing reportedly lobbied to keep the system off the required training list because additional type rating training would have cost airlines money and potentially cost Boeing sales. Remember that. The FAA, operating under a system in which Boeing itself certified much of its own safety compliance, approved the aircraft. The 737 MAX entered service in 2017. In October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea. 189 people died. Boeing's internal response was not to ground the aircraft. It was to issue a bulletin reminding pilots of existing procedures. 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, 157 more people dead. Same system, same failure mode, 346 people total. The 737 MAX was grounded in March 2019. It would remain grounded for 20 months, the longest grounding in commercial aviation history. The direct financial damage to Boeing was staggering. The company took charges and costs ultimately exceeding $20 billion related to the MAX crisis alone. Then came 2020. With the MAX still in crisis, COVID-19 collapsed global air travel. Boeing's commercial airplane deliveries fell from 380 in 2019 to just 157 in 2020. The company burned through cash at a rate of roughly $1 billion per month during parts of the crisis. It drew down credit lines. It suspended its dividend. Boeing's market capitalization, which had peaked at roughly $240 billion in early 2019, had collapsed. It raised approximately $25 billion in debt just to stay operational. A company that had spent decades returning cash to shareholders was now desperately borrowing it back from the market. In 2021, Boeing entered a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice, paying $2.5 billion to resolve charges that its employees had defrauded regulators. Fraud, not negligence, not an oversight. The word used was fraud. The reputational damage ran deeper than any number. Airlines that had been loyal Boeing customers for decades began diversifying aggressively toward Airbus. By 2023, Airbus held a larger share of commercial aircraft orders than Boeing, a position that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. In January 2024, a door plug blew out of an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 at 16,000 feet. No one died. The seats next to the opening happened to be empty. But the image of a gaping hole in the side of a commercial aircraft, mid-flight, became the story Boeing could not escape. Quality control failures. Again, still, congressional hearings followed. Whistleblowers testified. 2 of them died under circumstances that prompted public scrutiny. The FAA capped 737 MAX production rates. Boeing CEO David Calhoun, who had presided over the bulk of the post-MAX crisis, announced he would step down by the end of 2024. He was not the first CEO to leave under pressure. He will likely not be the last. Here is the lesson. Boeing did not fail because of one bad decision. It failed because of one bad philosophy, applied consistently over 25 years. When you systematically subordinate engineering judgment to financial engineering, you do not cut costs. You defer them. You accumulate them as invisible debt, paid eventually not in dollars but in disasters. The cruelest irony is that the cost-cutting didn't even work on its own terms. The billions saved on R&D on training programs on a new aircraft platform. They were repaid many times over in crisis costs, legal settlements, lost market share, and a brand that may take a generation to repair. The spreadsheet was wrong. The engineers were right. Next time, the company that invented the smartphone interface then watched someone else sell it to the world. Subscribe for more hidden empires.